Welcome, everybody. You've arrived at the Silver Hill Hospital Grand Rounds program, and we'll get started here just in a moment as people settle into their Zoom boxes. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Good to be with you. I'm Dr. Jeff Katzman. I'm the Director of Education here at Silver Hill Hospital. I'm glad you could join us today, and we are so privileged to welcome Dr. Ann McKnight, who will be presenting on the topic of the emotional system in the natural world and in the human family. And I have the honor to introduce her in just a moment. First, a little housekeeping, as usual. Our next Grand Rounds is next week on October 16th. So we'll have 3 in a row. And next week, we'll welcome back Dr. Brent Forster, who will present to us on the topic of evaluation and management of late life depression and older adult bipolar disorder. So please come back next week and tell a friend. Back to today's lecture. As always, your questions will remain a really important part of our Grand Rounds, and we really look forward to a great discussion at the conclusion of the presentation today. I will moderate that, and that will be at the end, as I said, of the presentation. But it will depend and rely on your questions. So throughout the talk is a great opportunity to put forward any questions and comments for Dr. McKnight, which you can submit all during the talk, as I said, by using the Q&A link. If you wish to receive CME or CEU credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in your browser when we end the webinar. We'll also email a copy of the survey to everybody participating today. Finally, disclosures. No planners of this activity have indicated a relevant financial relationship with an ACCME defined commercial interest. And it is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Ann McKnight. And I've really been looking forward to meeting Dr. McKnight, and I was really fortunate to get to chat with her before our presentation. I myself was a student at the Bowen Center last year in their postgraduate program. So it's great for me to get to meet somebody who is so connected with Bowen Family System and to teach all of us about it today. So Dr. McKnight is the Director Emerita of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. And he's a longtime student of Bowen Family Systems Theory, joining the faculty at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family in 1994 and serving as director there from 2010 to 2020. Dr. McKnight has used Bowen theory in her many years of clinical practice as a framework for helping individuals and families to adapt to the challenges they face. She's presented nationally and internationally on Bowen theory and its theoretical interface with systems in the natural world. Recently, she published an edited book called Thinking Systems, Applying Bowen Theory to Clinical Practice, as well as 2 journal articles recently, Bowen's Family Systems Theory and Bowlby's Attachment Theory, and Perspectives on Estrangement and the Bowen Theory Concept of Cutoff. So, Dr. McKnight, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak to us here at our Grand Rounds program. It's so great to welcome you, and I'm going to pass the baton to you, and I will see you at the end of your presentation for a discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm trying to get my... Well, welcome to all of you who are out there in the webinar. I am so pleased to be here this morning. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got involved in family systems. Because I think the emotional system in the natural world and in the human family is a pretty broad and esoteric subject. And I wanted to bring it down to my clinical work and how I found Bowen theory to be relevant to it when I first discovered systems ideas. So many years ago, and I have to say my son is grown and has his own family now. I had just had my son, um, who was maybe a year old. And I thought, I think I want to go back to work part-time. I love babies, but there's only so much you can talk about with a baby. So I started looking for jobs and I found this half-time job in a substance abuse. It was actually an alcohol center at that time. And so they were looking for a psychiatric social worker, and the center had a whole number of counselors who were recovering. And so at the time, I knew nothing about substance abuse, but I thought, well, this is a half-time job and I'll try it out. And over time, I learned a huge amount from the other counselors. Um, but I was kind of thrown in to the work without a lot of background. So literally my first client was this couple, and the family came in, and the wife said, my husband does nothing but drink. I mean, he doesn't help me take care of the children. He doesn't bring home his paycheck. Some nights he's out and I don't know where he is. Um, and I go, well, what to the husband, what do you want to do about this? And the husband says, well, I guess I should stop drinking. And I go, well, this is easy. I thought this was a hard problem to deal with, but he's going to stop drinking. So he goes to AA and he stops drinking, and they come back. And I say, well, how's it going? Because your husband stopped drinking. And she goes, well, it's not going so well. And I go, well, why not? He did what you wanted him to do. He goes, well, I bring home the paycheck, I help with the kids, I help with the housework. I'm really trying to be a responsible father here. And so then they come back again and I go, how's it going? He says, I'm sober, I'm doing well. And she goes, I just don't think things are going well. And so as time goes on, she gets more and more depressed. And he sort of continues on his route of being sober. And I'm like, what in the world is going on here? She should be happy about his doing, functioning better. So about that time, so it got me thinking. So the counselors couldn't really explain this to me, how this had happened in the family. I mean, there are ways of thinking about this in AA, that he got sober, but she didn't continue on that path with him. Um, but about that time, I met Dr. Bowen, and and he was presenting at the National Council of Alcoholism on the family. And I raised my hand and I say, Dr. Bowen, can you explain to me what happens in families with alcoholism? And he like waves his hand like this. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Um, and so then I began studying family systems theory. And what made sense to me is that the family is an interactive, dynamic unit, emotional unit. This is what I learned over time. And that when someone changes significantly in the family, that it redistributes the anxiety in the family and the way the family handles their interactions. Um, so anyway, that was my introduction. And over time, I got more and more interested in families with addiction and, the multi-generational aspects of it, the way that the emotion transfers when someone does something differently in the family. So anyway, I wanted to introduce myself in that way because to me, Bowen theory is a respectful way of helping families think about the problems they face. And that is sort of the underlying idea that I want to promote or explain with this presentation. So what I was grappling with that family was the emotional system in that family and how it functioned, and how the wife thought about her position in the family and how that shifted with the changes in her husband. So let me go forward with this presentation. So these are slides that Silver Hill asked me to include, which includes the educational objectives. So I want to talk a little bit about Murray Bowen. He lived from 1913 to 1990. He was originally he was a psychoanalyst. He worked at the Menninger Clinics in Topeka, Kansas. He was a psychiatrist, excuse me, and a researcher. But in his time as a psychiatry resident and his work at Menninger's, he began to question Freudian theory, which I know all of you are familiar with, about the id, the ego, and the psycho, the superego. And he began to question that the neuroses and the psychoses that emerged in his patients were totally within the individual. He noticed that symptoms would flare up when there were visits from the family, and that significant family members affected the way the patient operated. So he, as I had done with my first client, began to question how does a patient function in relationship to the important others in their family. He began to study ethnology and read in the natural sciences. And that's a little bit of what this presentation is about. So from 1956 to 1959, this was in the beginnings of NIMH, where they were doing all kinds of crazy research. They accepted him as a researcher. And what he did was hospitalize first a schizophrenic member of a family and their mother, and then he enlarged the research study to include fathers and siblings. And during that time, he came to believe or observe the family as an emotional unit. That would, I will go and talk more about that. And that there were two variables that affected the way the family operated. One was the level of differentiation, which he would look at as the level of competency or maturity of the family, and the level of anxiety or the reactivity to the challenges the family faced. Do they have few resources? Has someone in the family died, an important person, a mother, a grandmother, a father? Is there unemployment? What are the challenges this family is trying to adapt to? And in that process, he created a theory that included these ideas of differentiation, the operation of triangles in the family, the nuclear family emotional process, the family projection process, sibling position, the multi-generational transmission process, the concept of cutoff, and societal emotional process. And I know that's a lot to engage, but I wanted to at least identify the concepts of his theory. So what he was trying to do was to create a science of human behavior, which was congruent with the natural world. One of his criticisms of Freudian theory was that Freud used myths and interpretations to try to capture how an individual was operating, like the Oedipus conflict. And he said, no, let's go back to nature and look at how species organize themselves to survive and to raise their young. So, he would say that the elephant troop is it's matriarchal, but that's an emotional system, and that different species organize themselves in different ways to manage themselves in their environments and to survive. And that the human family, and this is 4 generations of this family, also does that. So he said that the emotional system is the human's evolutionary link to the natural world. That does not mean the human is organized in the same way, but that different species organize themselves in different ways, but that there is this thread that goes through evolutionary time, which is the emotional system. So he says he wrote, there are some basic assumptions about man and the nature of emotional illness, including the notion of an emotional system. Man is viewed as, or you would say the human is viewed as an evolutionary assemblage of cells who has arrived at his or her present state from hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary adaptation and maladaptation, and who is evolving on to other changes. In this sense, man is directly related to all living matter. So this is the tree of life, and here is the human down here, and that the human has evolved with certain specific adaptations, which includes an enlarged brain, the capacity for language, the capacity for abstract thinking, but that underneath all of that, the human has absorbed the adaptations of the previous evolutionary adaptations. And I mean, an example would be that viruses play a role in our physiology. These have been absorbed from many millennia of evolution now, but they are still with the human. And he would say that the emotional system is reflective in the human of the biological processes of other forms of life. So this is the evolutionary tree, and here is the human down here that has absorbed parts of this in an emotional system that is operational in all of us today. So what are the functions of an emotional system across evolution? It includes these 5 processes that are present in the bee, in the beehive, and present in the human, in our complex present beings. It includes the defense of the unit. It includes procreation and the protection of the young, the survival of the young. It includes procuring resources and communicating within the unit. So integral to the emotional system of each species is the interplay between the individual and the collective unit. And that is, the individual is regulated by the unit, and the unit is affected by the individual member of the unit. There is a reciprocal interplay between a family system and the individuals in it. And the capacity to, for the unit and the individual to have an interchange and cooperate leads to the survival of the individual and the unit. So the behavior of a bee, a forest, and a chimpanzee is regulated, but also co-regulated in the system of which they are a part. So I want to talk about three scientists as examples. This is Dr. Thomas Seeley. He's at Cornell, and he has studied the operations of honeybee colonies. So Dr. Seeley goes to this island in Maine, and he labeled all the different bees in this colony. I mean, it's unbelievable what his research was. And what he discovered was that individual bees are important to the survival of the colony. That is, there is an interplay between the individual and the colony in as elementary a species. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't want to say primitive, but in the insect world, in the species of the bee, the bees go out to find nesting sites that are appropriate, and they have to be a certain amount, certain level off the ground. They have to be a certain size. I mean, it's a fairly sophisticated evaluation. So the individual bee goes out and looks for a nesting site, and there's a variety of bees that do that. They come back to the colony and they do a dance. So this is a demonstration of a dance right here. And they dance in different directions with different movements. And then the colony chooses the bee they think has the most appropriate nesting site. Now that's pretty incredible, don't you think? So then the swarm goes to that nesting site. And the reason he talks about honeybee democracy is because they have to agree. That is, if they do not agree on the best site, they have less chances for survival and adaptation. And for a honeybee colony to divide, like to have differences of opinion, is pretty fatal to the colony. They have to agree to where to take their queen. So I just think that's fascinating. So the individual is regulating the colony, and the colony is co-regulating with the individual. So then we start thinking about the human family and the impact of the individual on the family and the impact of the family on the individual and how they co-regulate. So each individual bee is self-regulated as well as co-regulated by the group. So that's an idea that I want to keep coming back to. So a second scientist I want to talk about is Suzanne Simard, and she wrote Finding the Mother Tree. And this is sort of revolutionary research. So she explored the interconnections among various species of trees that communicate and offer resources to one another in a complex system of forest ecology. So in forestry, so she was a forester, or she is a forester. So in forestry, the idea is you plant trees in a line that are the same species, and that any other tree that would come up near them would be competitive. And she began to question that assumption. So she said the mother trees grow in a complex of interrelationships with their offspring and other species in the forest. So she came to believe, or to prove, that the forest is an interconnected ecosystem. And what her basic ideas are, that as the seasons go on or change, that the trees provide resources to other trees, and it can be their young, that is the saplings, but it also can be to other trees, other types of trees, species of trees. And this is a demonstration of how through the rhizomes, the resources are given to the saplings, and the carbon exchange over the seasons shifts from one species of trees to another. So this is just a diagram of the different types of trees and the kinds of connections they have with one another. And one of the interesting things is that if a parasite or a virus hits one tree in a forest, that tree can communicate that to another tree. And the tree then the other tree can begin to organize their resources to fight that. So that in the forest, the trees are not competitive, but they are mutually enhancing. Now, the last person I want to talk about is Jane Goodall, who you probably all know a great deal about. But it's a more humanoid species. That is, it's the species that biologically comes from, or evolutionarily comes from, before the human. And she talks about the mother-infant co-regulation. So she's talking about the position of the mother in the colony or in the group, and how the position of the mother affects the capacity of the infant to survive to adulthood. And I think some of this is attachment theory, but she says particularly important is the disposition of the mother. Her position in the family And if his or her position, that would be of the infant in the family. If there are siblings, the sex of the siblings and their personalities. A secure childhood is likely to lead to self-reliance and independence in adulthood. A disturbed early life may leave permanent scars. So, so she's talking about how the infant's position in the family system affects the capacity of the infant to survive. So she talks about Flo and how she was such a competent mother, and that part of her ability had to do with her position in the larger colony with the adult males. That Fifi, her infant, became self-confident and assertive as her mother was in relation to her mother's position in the larger colony. So what we're talking about is that the way the individual emerges from the system has to do with that individual's position in the system and the system's way of operating with that individual. That is, there's the co-regulation between the individual and the system, and that the way that co-regulation operates has an impact on the next generation. So this is Passion, and Passion had a different relationship with the colony. She was a loner, had no friends. She had a child named Pom. Pom was anxious and clinging. And they had a period of infanticide where they snatched babies and ate them. So there was a very different outcome for the position that the mother had in the colony. So what I'm trying to punch up here is that there is a variation in the interplay of the individual with the larger system that influence the adaptation of the group. That is, if the colony chose a bee who hadn't really found an adequate nesting site, that compromised the colony. And that if the trees were cut down and they weren't allowed to relate to each other, that compromised the individual tree. And that if the chimpanzee was not able to relate effectively in the unit, that affected the outcome of the infant. So Bowen talks about the evolution of the emotional system. His ideas are not the same as Darwin's survival of the fittest. Bowen theory is evolution-like. It talks about how one generation impacts the next and the next and the next. So Bowen says, so I'm going to talk about the human family now. And he says, the family is a number of different kinds of systems. I'm trying to read behind this. We think of the family as a combination of an emotional, a social, a relationship systems. The term emotional refers to the force that motivates the system and the relationship to the way it is expressed. That is, the emotional system would be the way that we're wired together. The imprint of the family system on our emotional lives and the way we react, the way we think about how relationships should operate. And the way we carry that out is the relationship system. That is the way it is translated into our um, our um, our families. So the basic idea, the theoretical premise, is that the human family is an interdependent unit of individuals, an emotional system that engages and adapts to the challenges the family face from both within the family and in the environment. So you can go, so families can operate in a range of ways. For some families, there is substantial disturbance within the family. That is, there's domestic violence, or there's reactivity, there's great distance between the family members. It can vary about how the family is operating. But the challenges they face can come from within the family, and the anxiety that rests within the family. And then challenges can come from the environment. We just looked at the flooding and the hurricanes, the war in Gaza. These are extreme challenges for families. And how does the family organize to manage themselves in these challenges? So one of the ideas that Bowen brought in his observations, particularly in his research project, is that there were various ways that the family reacted to the challenges they faced, to the tension of working together. So his view would be, as families try to organize to adapt to the challenges they face, there is a variation in families' capacity to work together, to cooperate, to problem solve. So I'm going to talk about this human family as an emotional system. I've done considerable research on this family, and they, I would say, had a moderate level of differentiation, which included varying patterns of handling their anxiety over the generations. These include, in Bowen theory, there are 4 ways of managing tension or anxiety. One is conflict. That is, if tension arises, you can just fight about it, and then move to your corners. The family projection process addresses ways in which family anxiety gets focused on a child. And we can talk about the various ways, but that a mother, let's say a grandmother, dies, and the mother feels very sad about that. And then she starts worrying about Susie. And is Susie, she's not learning to read yet. Maybe there's something wrong with her. And somehow that level of reaction, of sadness, gets focused on Susie without even the mother realizing it. There is over-under functioning reciprocity, which I was describing with a family with alcoholism. And there's distance and cutoff, which I was explaining to Dr. Katzman is one of my favorite topics. That is, if tension arises with mom, one way is just to kind of distance, cut her out of your life. So I'm going to talk about George and Hannah. George and Hannah were, and part of what I'm trying to communicate is that I don't think our families emerged out of the 21st century. I think we all have imprints of generations of family functioning. We just often can't see it. So anyway, George and Hannah were raised in the 19th century. George was the sixth of 12 children. He was the son of a minister, and he became a minister. And what's interesting in George's family, and I don't have enough data to analyze it, is that his younger brother was schizophrenic. So, what do you want to do with that? But anyway, George was very compliant and did what his father wanted him to do, which is become a minister. And he met Hannah, and Hannah was the youngest of 9 children. And when her father was asked to be the president of the University of Georgia, the family moved to Georgia, and within 3 months he died, and she was an orphan. So her mother moved back to live with the older siblings, and she sort of gravitated around to the various siblings who helped to support Hannah and her mother as she grew up. So she was basically an orphan. Now, George and Hannah had 3 children. One was Mary, one was Thomas. There was a child who died at the age of 1, and then Will was born. So one of the concepts of Bowen theory is that the way family anxiety is managed is in a variety of ways. And one of the ways is to focus on a child. Now, I obviously was not there and do not have specific data about how this family felt. All I can do is report what happened. And Thomas was a rebel. So in contrast to George, who kind of followed his father's footsteps, Thomas did not go with the program. And he reacted in a variety of ways that were not okay with his family. And this family was an extremely respected family in a very small town where George was the pastor. So let me go back for just a second. So ultimately, Thomas left the family and moved to Hawaii, where he never returned. So this would be called, in Bowen theory, this is cut off. And it is a way of managing tension in a family. That is, Thomas could not handle the disapproval of his family, and he went out to Hawaii to try his to try his luck in Hawaii, which did not turn out well. So I'm just using this family to demonstrate some of the ideas of Bowen theory. So Mary, the oldest daughter, marries Ross, and they have 4 children. The oldest son, and then 3 daughters. So Ross, who came from a working class family, he has his own story where he ran away from home and was sent to live with this uncle Cy in this little town in Illinois. And he became, he helped his uncle, and then became, he began to loan money to farmers, and then he started a bank. So he was very successful at work, very focused on his work. And Mary was very active in the church, very revered. However, this turned into an over-under functioning reciprocity. So as Ross worked hard and was very respected in this town, Mary became very ill after the death of her mother. Well, let me go back. She was in sanitaria. They never knew exactly what the physiological problem was. She was in hospital, sanitaria. She went to live outside of the town and the home. She lived in the South for a while. And in the letters between Ross and Mary, he would always say, "Do you need money?" Which I think he was trying to take care of her. But she would be off somewhere trying to deal with her illnesses. So this happens in families where one person looks very symptomatic and the other person looks very capable. But the idea would be that there's a reciprocity to those interactions. And sometimes that's hard to see, but in my work with families with alcoholism, it was so interesting to see how one member would be super functional, very, very acclaimed in work, and the other member, it could be a wife or it could be a husband, would look pretty problematic and dysfunctional. So George, the oldest son, marries Elsie, and Elsie was the daughter who was prized in this family. That is, she had an incredible amount of positive affirmations. She was very, very important. And I think that projection can work both ways, that the child can be held to be like the golden boy or the rebel, that it can go both ways. It's just the child has the weight of the family's expectations, and they either rise to them and get caught in them, or they react to them as not being accepted or approved of. We can talk more about that. But often people say, well, you know, my sister was the favorite, but I wasn't the favorite. And I go, lucky you, lucky you. You don't want to be the favorite. So she traveled all over the world, and her father was a newspaper man, and he reported on countries around the world. So they had a daughter that was born a year after they were married, and after the death of Elsie's father. Elsie's father died suddenly, and Molly was born right after that. So this was a very big shock to Elsie, who was very attached to her father, who had traveled around the world with her father, had been her father's secretary. And this created a family disruption that was difficult for this family. So another concept in Bowen theory, and I know this is a lot uh, to integrate, is that the family projection process is reflective. It is the way the family is managing the anxiety that they are experiencing. So Elsie was very upset, and this somehow seemed to be absorbed by, this is Elsie, this is George, and this is the oldest daughter. So, to me, this is an interesting question. I mean, just because people die early doesn't mean they are necessarily the object of the way they're not necessarily absorbing the anxiety of the family, but I think it's also a possibility. So, in what way did Elsie adapt in this marriage? She died at the age of 58. She had breast cancer, which she didn't tell any, which was treated, but then it metastasized, and she didn't tell her daughters. Um, and is this an adaptation in the family? Um, so she dies pretty suddenly and pretty unexpectedly, and this affects this oldest daughter. So, in what way are these patterns of adaptation in the grandmother, in Elsie, in this daughter, transferred across generations? Or are these just simply coincidences? That's a realistic thing. But if you look at, so differentiation in the family is the capacity of the family to adapt to challenges over time. And at some level, this was a very successful family. They were respected in their community. They were successful economically. They came from few resources and made their way to contribute to the growth of the community where they lived. They have churches and streets named after them, and some of them came into national prominence. But they were also marked by cutoff, early death, child projection, and over/under functioning reciprocity. That oldest daughter died of alcoholism, which I discovered after I began working at the family didn't talk about this. But in what ways did this family repeat patterns of managing anxiety over the generations? So they, I would say they are apart. They exhibit a moderate level of differentiation. They succeeded in many ways, and there were certain members of the family that kind of fell by the wayside. They cut off, they died early, they had a lot of symptoms over time. So that's the question. What does differentiation look like in a family? What strengths do they use to go forward through the generations? And what are ways that they adapt and cope with the tension in the family that becomes symptomatic? So differentiation in an individual, according to Dr. Bowen, is the capacity to manage emotion calmly when it is triggered in the interactions of the family. That a differentiated individual is purposeful, thoughtful, reflective, can see other points of view in the family, can cooperate, can define a position. These are all aspects of differentiation. Differentiation of a family, that is, people can vary in their levels of differentiation in a family, but the differentiation level of a family is the ability to cooperate in engaging and adapting to the challenges it faces from the environment and from within the unit. So there were various levels of differentiation in this family. There were people who were not successful or connected, and people who were very resourceful and really became a great resource to the family members. So this is my last slide. So that one of the questions that rises is, in what way is thinking about the emotional system in the natural world as foundational to that of the human family useful to us clinicians? And I had a colleague who was a psychiatric nurse in a hospital in Baltimore. And the nurses were very upset that they thought the doctors, the physicians, were not treating them respectfully in this particular hospital. And she said, you know, the way I look at this is sometimes I just see those doctors down there, down the hall, like silverback gorillas. You know, they're just beating their chests and trying to look big. And then I'm not so reactive. So if one thinks about the emotional system in a family rather than the individual's pathology, is one able to be a better resource to that family? And if one thinks about, there are variations in human families, some of them, that is, what is a family capable of? Some families are very capable of rising out of very difficult situations with a lot of emotionality. Some families have less. It doesn't have to do with education. It has to do with emotional functioning. Some families are less capable, and they're pretty mired down. And in what way does one lend a hand to those families? And how does one engage with a family to help an individual or the family, but particularly an individual, to think about, in what way are they reacting in the automatic patterns that they don't even realize they're in, like cutoff is an example, so that they can take steps to do things in a way that's more reflective of how they would like to be on this earth. That represents the way that their ethics would determine their lives and how they live their lives. So maybe you move towards someone that has annoyed you, or you reflectively think and speak with someone who's upset. Anyway, we can talk more about that. And I think I've just left enough time for your questions and discussion.
Dr. McKnight, thank you so very much. I could listen to you for another hour or two or more. You have a beautiful way of presenting this information, and it's just an honor to have you with us today. So to everybody out there, if you can, if you have questions for Dr. McKnight, it would be fantastic to get those in so we can use those to facilitate a conversation over the next 20, 25 minutes. So I will get us started. Dr. McKnight, can you talk a little bit about kind of the steps or processes of an individual working on differentiation of self, and how one kind of goes about that, from the lens of Bowen theory, and what that would mean for an individual?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is it's a good idea to have a coach
Mm.
because all of us, I mean, this is me, you, all of us, um, have trouble stepping back from the intensity of our families to think about how it's functioning. I mean, the other thought is it's useful to understand the concepts of the theory. I mean, we didn't talk really a lot about, triangles, but often when you're in conflict with somebody, there's a third party. And triangles are one of the easiest concepts to explain and one of the hardest to integrate. So it's what I would say, it's not, there are books out there you can read. Dr. Kerr wrote several long tomes. Dr. Bowen wrote a whole book, or a book of articles that have been compiled in a book. And then there are a number of other more popular writings that are out there. But I think it's pretty important to have that neutral individual.
In the coach, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I have a couple of questions coming in, and I'm going to go back a step. Carlo Cadato wrote in, can you explain a little bit more about the concept of differentiation within Bowen theory and what it really means?
Well, I think the concept of differentiation is really couched in the emotional system of the family. So how much are all of us like automatically wired to respond in ways that were imprinted when we were young? I mean, I know imprint is Lorenz's idea, but I think, it's not necessarily instinctual. It's more like osmosis. How are emotions handled in my family? I mean, in my family, one of the reasons I liked the idea of cutoff so much is because we were pretty good at cutoff. And, that's a complex term or idea too. But in every family, it's different. And there's a certain amount of family pressure to be like the family interprets as the way they should operate. You should do this because this is George. I mean, he became a minister like his father, or you become, you join a country club because that's what your family does, or you treat your child with this particular way of operating because that's what you learned as you were a child. So differentiation is the effort to try to understand that better what happened that impacted you? And, I began to look at, well, I left college and I didn't keep in touch with my college friends. I didn't keep in touch with my graduate school friends. I just went from place to place. And then I realized that that was something that I kind of learned from my family. So how do you see that? And that's, you know, where the coach fits in often. And then how do you make choices about it? And so part of my choices have been to move toward my family, to move toward my friends, to move toward people I've known over time. I mean, that's just a little example of um, one way I think we handle managing relationships in ways that are reflective of what we just automatically think was the way our family did it. And the family, I think in differentiation, as one tries to determine a way of going forward that's within your principles. That's what the way you would like to operate, which is not always the way one could do it. The family can put pressure on you and say, well, I don't think that's not the way we operate it. You're doing it wrong. And then the question is, how do you manage yourself with the pressures of the family? We're Italians and we yell at each other. I mean, I don't want to typecast you know, any particular ethnic tradition. And there are good things the family brings to it, but the question is, what do you want to keep, and what do you want as an individual to determine with in your autonomy? So that's the best I could do. I mean, I think one of the things, one of the tests that Dr. Bowen would put out is how does a person manage themselves in times of high emotionality? And in my family, one of the challenging times is in times of death of important people, where family members can get
Mhm.
very reactive to each other. Let me put it that way. And so anyway, I don't think that's necessarily the greatest explanation, but that's one.
No, it's very helpful. I think it's great. I'm also wondering, because you've showed us a family of multiple generations, and what happened in there. Do you think that there is value for um, either for a person themselves in terms of differentiation to kind of understand their own lineage and genogram and family background? Is that part of differentiation also to make that understanding, and do you do that with your clients?
Absolutely. I think people can't really see the impact of the family unless they look at three generations. You think, well, this is the way I am. Well, no, what about Aunt Jane? I mean, often if you see a family where there's a problem child and you go up a couple generations, well, mom's brother was just like that. But they're acting like this child is doing something special. Well, how did your parents handle Uncle Peter? So I think it's really, how is your relationship with your daughter similar or different than your relationship with your mother and her relationship with her mother? And I think there's such a rich level of understanding if you can see how things repeat in families.
Mhm.
I mean, Dr. Bowen has this, I didn't put it in these slides, but he has this quote that I love. And there are no, if you go back several generations, there are no angels and no devils, but just human beings trying to do the best they could do.
It's all
And I
such a,
think that if you take it up there, you realize that what's happening in the present has happened before. And there's nobody to blame. I mean, that's the big thing about Bowen theory. You can't blame anybody because is it grandpa's fault? Well, what about the other, you know, 200 people that came before grandpa? And, it just helps people be more neutral about the problems they face in the present.
yeah, it's very also compassionate way of understanding all of us. It's beautiful. And I want to turn to the questions now. John Allen out there, a big hello. John says, thank you for this magnificent presentation on the natural basis of emotion as a motivating force. I am comfortable with the idea that individual cells are mind-like in showing social cognition. I associate emotion with feelings. How do you think about emotion in bees? That bee example was just amazing to me, actually, and those bee dances. What about the question of emotions experienced by the bees?
Well, I mean, Darwin wrote a book about this. I don't know if he included bees. But, I think what Bowen was trying to, I mean, bees communicate and they can get mad, so that the way that, I mean, you could call it emotion. You could call it emotion. I mean, I'm not an expert on cells, so I don't, but in the bee example, the way they regulate with each other, I think is a level of emotion. That is, they can get upset and come and attack you. They can communicate with each other and make a plan, plan to move. Um, and I think that that's what Bowen was trying to address, that there is a way of operating as a system that has has ways of communicating upset, desire for a new location, whatever words you want to. I was going to say that one of the books I read recently it was the Immense World. What is the author's name? Is it Stephen Chen? Anyway, I heard him at the Smithsonian Book Fair and I got interested. And what he talks about is the ways different animals have, like spiders have eyes in their legs. All these, the echolocation, the different ways that species adapt and connect. But all of that, I think, is the way that particular species adapts to their environment, communicates in their environment. And I would call that a level of emotion, but I don't know if that's necessarily the definition that's out there in the world.
Yeah, yeah. We have a question here. Can you talk about the ideas of resilience and how these ideas impact one's feelings and reactions within the family pressures and patterns?
Yeah, resilience is an interesting question. Well, I think theoretically, that families that are more connected, that have more viable connections, have more resilience. That would be a family framework. That is, the more fragmented a family is, and the individuals in that family. I mean, who are homeless people? They are people who the families are not caretaking. There are other people where the families are taking care of the individual that's not capable of managing themselves. So it's, in what way is the family a resource when there are problems? I mean, I think the other way of thinking about it individually is that when a child is part of the family projection process, that child has less capacity. That is, when the parents step in and try to solve the problems of the child, or try to get the child fixed, or whatever way that the child is thought of as not capable, that that cuts into the capacity. It impedes the capacity of the child to be resilient, if that makes any sense. I mean, the brother of Mary, I didn't, in this particular presentation, I didn't include him, but he was the richest man in Illinois at a certain point, and his brother was penniless in Hawaii, and his children, who were discovered later, um, one of his children had rickets from malnutrition. So, you know, how did this happen in this family with the same parents? You have this guy over here who was a senator. You have this guy over here who was not functioning very well. And I just think that the youngest brother somehow was freer. But I don't know how that exactly is an answer to resilience.
Mhm. It seems like one other connection is at the degree that somebody has done what you've talked about in terms of thought about their family and not responding to the automatic um,
How do you
ideas that,
gain resilience?
yes, exactly, that's such an important.
Now, if I don't cut off all the different people I knew over my lifetime, how much more resources do I have? That's the question. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, so there's a question from Michael Piliero here. Thank you for the question, Michael. Is it all about managing anxiety, or are we talking about the family's way of managing all uncomfortable emotions in the system, like depression and anger?
Well, I mean, these are all wonderful questions. We could have a whole course of them. So Bowen included depression and rage, even joy, in a spectrum of intensity. I mean, that's a big thing about Bowen. It's about the level of intensity. And he would lump all of those under anxiety versus the traditional viewpoint of like an anxiety disorder, where the person is washing their hands too much or something. Um, and the thing that I think is different and also important is that in Bowen theory, the family as an emotional unit is thought of as having family anxiety. So, for instance, when I'm talking about this family that I presented, where the one brother was pretty dysfunctional, the other brother very capable and thought of as the family star. Um, there was a differential absorption. There was family anxiety, but a differential absorption of that anxiety by the different children. So it is a really different way of thinking about anxiety. That is, you know, if a mother worries about a son and spends a lot of emotional energy on that son, in what way is she not objecting to her husband working too much? I mean, you know, it's a way of a family unit managing anxiety.
Yeah. Um, Another question here. Thank you so much for this presentation. Will patients usually know what the influence of the family is on their emotions and actions when they come to you, or does this take time for them to come to these realizations?
Well, usually so the way I work is I ask people about their families. You know, I acknowledge the presenting problem, and then I ask them about their families. Like, just tell me about where are you from? How old are your mom and dad? You know, and then over a couple of sessions, I would ask them about their grandparents. And I mean, if they say, well, this has nothing to do with my wife having an affair, I'd say probably not. But I think it's important for me to just better understand the way your family is operated.
Mhm.
And I think when you ask people, so when I used to work in an office, I would diagram the family for them, and they would go, "Oh, wow. You know, that makes me think of, you know, my father's brother and how he operated." Um, so I don't so much ask them about their emotions. I ask them about the facts of their family and then about how they see the relationships. And they will talk about the emotions. You know, my mom, when I left home, I didn't talk to my mom, you know, and now my daughter doesn't talk to me. You know,
Right.
so it's not so much the emotions, it's more trying to better understand the family functioning and how emotion fits into that.
Great. Uh, Matt Wicker just wrote in, do you typically see family change via breakthrough moments or gradual improvement in differentiation?
I think it's a lot of work,
Mhm.
honestly. And I think when someone does something very different, I'm trying to think of, because there was something that just came up recently. Um, Now I can't think of it. But but I will tell a story about my colleague who wrote a lot of books about Bowen theory, Roberta Gilbert. And I think she would allow me to tell this story because she tells it in a public way. Roberta Gilbert was a psychoanalyst, and she kept getting psychoanalyzed, but she said nothing really changed. And so she came and was on the faculty of the Bowen Center and studied Bowen theory. And she said, I kept going back to my family. And when I would go and visit my father, he would say, you're not doing something right. And I would leave being depressed. And that happened to me for years. And then one day, we were walking around the lake near his home. And he said, you know, Roberta, you just haven't figured this one out. And I said to him, Dad, I know you think that, but I don't agree with you. This is the way I think about it. And I went home and I wasn't depressed. But that was, I would say, she would say that would be that would be a sort of a light bulb moment or whatever you call it.
After a lot of work.
after she had really worked to establish other relationships in her family and, um, with her kids and with her children.
There's a question here about codependency. Um, we are taught in school that codependency is bad, but these theories show that codependency is beneficial and essential to optimal functioning and survival. The codependency is a positive aspect rather than dysfunctional. Can you tease that apart a little bit?
Sure. These are just great questions, and
Mhm.
I hope you all will follow up. So you can go to www.thebowencenter.org if you want more information. Um, okay, in family systems theory, codependency is talked about as fusion. And that would be when one person's functioning depends on another. And we all have fusion in our lives. What we're talking about in Bowen theory would be the capacity of an individual to have a defined relationship system with the important relationships of which they are a part. And so this is because it's often, I mean, Bowen would sort of think about, so it's this interplay between individuality, that is, what do I need to do for my own life to make it meaningful, to choose a partner, to do whatever, to have kids or not have kids, whatever I think is important in my life. And in what way can I stay connected to the important relationships? Not do exactly what they want me to do, not depend upon them when I can depend on myself, but be connected. And I think that's a different codependency sees it, at least in my experience in substance abuse, sees it as a pathology. Whereas in Bowen theory, it's more this interplay between what do you need to do to have your own life and what do you need to do to be connected to the people who are important to you. Um, and the way he talks about it, we're coming down on time. The way he talks about it is, what does it take to be responsible to self and also to be responsible to others that are important? And that's in a community too, what do you do? And how do you know the difference? That's kind of the St. Francis prayer. But what is it? How do you hold on to your principles and what you think is important, but not, but also be capable of understanding that others have different opinions and ways of doing things.
So many more questions I could ask you and that are appearing here. Many comments of gratitude for the presentation. Let me just end with one because I know we were promised to end on time here for everyone. Sherry Marconi is asking, can you suggest an easy to understand book for family members to read and understand? Is there a book that you use like in your practice to help families understand these ideas?
Well, I think Roberta Gilbert's Extraordinary Relationships is one that I think talks to people at a basic, I don't mean a simple level, but without using a lot of jargon. And the other one is Growing Myself Up, um, which is by a woman out of Australia. Um, but I think she does an excellent job of talking to lay people.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. I will look at those and I'm sure others will too. Dr. McKnight, thank you so much for this inspiring presentation with so much information. Thank you, everybody here, for joining us today. So as just a reminder, for those wishing to receive continuing education credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in the browser as we end the webinar. And here we've been connected, maybe fused. We've been a group here together that will go our separate ways now. And Dr. McKnight, it's great to meet you. And
Thank you, Dr.
so much
Katz.
for joining
Yeah.
us. Yes. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.